Number 1. Judy Buenoano. Judy Buenoano's name is carved into Florida's criminal history as one of the most cold-blooded women ever to walk its soil. To outsiders, she was a devoted mother, a charming nurse, and later a successful businesswoman. But behind that carefully polished mask was a woman driven by greed, deception, and a terrifying willingness to kill anyone who stood in the way of her next insurance payout. Born in Texas in 1943, Judy's childhood was far from idyllic. Her mother died when she was young, and she was sent to live with abusive relatives. Friends and family remembered her as a girl hardened by neglect, someone who learned early that survival meant manipulation. That sharp edge carried into adulthood, where she mastered the art of making people trust her, even as she plotted their downfall. Her first known victim was her husband, James Goodyear, a decorated Air Force sergeant. In 1971, he suddenly fell gravely ill, suffering weeks of agonizing symptoms before his death. Doctors initially attributed it to natural causes, but years later tests revealed he had been poisoned with arsenic, a toxin Judy had quietly fed him while preparing to cash in on his life insurance. Judy didn't stop there. In 1978, her boyfriend Bobby Joe Morris also died under strikingly similar circumstances. Once again, Judy walked away with money in her pocket. But perhaps the most disturbing crime of all was what happened to her own son, Michael. At just 19, Michael was a paraplegic after a sudden illness left him dependent on braces and a wheelchair. In 1980, Judy took him canoeing on Florida's East River. Witnesses later recalled the boat mysteriously capsizing. Judy swam to safety, but Michael drowned, weighed down by his heavy equipment. The tragedy might have passed as an accident, if not for the hefty life insurance Judy collected afterward. Authorities began to see a pattern: too many sudden illnesses, too many deaths in Judy's orbit, too much money changing hands. By the early 1980s, investigators reopened cases, exhumed bodies, and confirmed arsenic poisoning in multiple victims. The trail of evidence finally caught up to her. In 1983, Judy was convicted of first-degree murder for killing Michael, along with fraud and attempted murder charges tied to other schemes. She was sentenced to death, making her the first woman executed in Florida since 1848. On March 30, 1998, she walked to the electric chair. Her final words were chillingly calm. No. That was all she said when asked if she had any last statement. Judy Buenoano became known as Florida's true Black Widow. To the very end, she showed no remorse. Her legacy remains a stark reminder that not all killers lurk in the shadows. Some smile, some play the role of caregiver, and some use love itself as their most dangerous weapon. Number 2. Ashley McArthur. Some of Florida's most haunting crimes aren't committed by strangers in the night, but by those we trust the most. That's what makes the case of Ashley McArthur so chilling. A former crime scene technician in Pensacola, McArthur was trained to uncover the truth. But in 2017, she turned her expertise toward deception, covering up a crime that shocked even her closest friends. Ashley's background gave her an unusual credibility. Having worked in forensics, she understood how investigators thought and what evidence could trap a suspect. But beneath that professional front, she carried heavy debts and a gambling problem that would push her toward betrayal. Her victim was not just a casual acquaintance, it was her best friend, a private investigator named Taylor Wright. Taylor was a former police officer herself, a woman described as strong, independent, and unafraid to stand her ground. At the time, she was embroiled in a bitter divorce and entrusted Ashley with $34,000 she wanted hidden during the proceedings. Taylor believed Ashley would keep the money safe. Instead, that trust became her undoing. On September 8, 2017, Taylor was reported missing after she failed to pick up her son. Friends grew immediately concerned. Taylor was not the kind of mother to disappear without explanation. Suspicion quickly turned toward Ashley, who claimed she had last seen Taylor when the two had gone out together. But investigators noticed cracks in her story. Surveillance cameras placed Ashley in areas she hadn't mentioned. Phone records revealed suspicious movements, and Taylor's remains were eventually discovered on a remote Pensacola farm linked to Ashley's family. She had been shot in the back of the head. The betrayal stunned the community. People couldn't fathom how Ashley could coldly execute her best friend and then carry on as though nothing had happened. Prosecutors argued that greed was the driving force. Ashley had already spent the money and knew Taylor would eventually demand it back. Forensic evidence tied her to the scene, and her lies unraveled under scrutiny. In 2019, Ashley McArthur was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The verdict closed one chapter, but the story continues to echo as a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us carry the darkest secrets. What makes this case particularly unnerving is Ashley's background. She wasn't ignorant of crime scene investigations. She had once been part of the system, and yet she chose to believe she was clever enough to beat it. That overconfidence proved to be her downfall. Ashley McArthur's betrayal was more than a financial scheme. It was a violation of friendship, trust, and loyalty. And in Florida's long line of infamous women, her crime stands as one of the most personal and devastating. Number 3. Sheila Keen-Warren. Of all the crimes in Florida's history, few are as surreal as the one that became known as the Killer Clown case. It sounds like a horror movie. A clown walking up to a front door with balloons and flowers, only to pull out a gun and fire. But for Marlene Warren and her family in Wellington, Florida, this nightmare was terrifyingly real. The date was May 26, 1990. Marlene Warren, a successful businesswoman and mother, was at home with her 22-year-old son and several friends. Around 10:45 a.m., a Chrysler LeBaron pulled into the driveway. Out stepped someone dressed head to toe as a clown, orange wig, red nose, full makeup. In their hands were 2 balloons and a floral arrangement. One balloon read, "You're the greatest." When Marlene answered the door, the clown handed her the gifts. Then, without a word, pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and shot her in the face. Marlene collapsed as the clown calmly walked back to the car and drove away. She would die 2 days later in the hospital. The image of the killer clown instantly captured national headlines. Who could commit such a bizarre and brazen act in broad daylight? Suspicion quickly fell on Sheila Keen, a 26-year-old woman who was romantically involved with Marlene's husband, Michael Warren. At the time, Sheila worked repossessing cars for Michael's dealership. Rumors swirled that their relationship was more than professional, and Marlene herself had confided in friends about the growing tension in her marriage. Investigators suspected Sheila almost immediately, but the case was far from straightforward. No clown costume was ever recovered, and forensic technology in 1990 couldn't definitively link her to the crime. The Chrysler LeBaron was eventually found abandoned, but physical evidence was minimal. For decades, the case went cold, lingering as one of Florida's strangest unsolved murders. Then in 2014, advances in DNA testing gave investigators new leads. Evidence from the original crime scene was reanalyzed, and a case began to build. Witnesses were re-interviewed, including employees who had sold Sheila clown makeup and balloons shortly before the murder. In 2017, nearly 27 years after the crime, Sheila Keen-Warren was arrested in Virginia, where she had been living under a new identity, married to none other than Michael Warren. The trial was long delayed, marked by legal maneuvering and questions about evidence integrity after so many years. But in 2023, Sheila finally entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison, with credit for time served. For many, the resolution was bittersweet. Marlene's family had waited decades for justice, and while Sheila's sentence was relatively short for such a brutal crime, her admission of guilt at least confirmed what they had always suspected. The Killer Clown case remains one of Florida's most infamous crimes, a reminder of how jealousy, obsession, and betrayal can twist into something so bizarre it defies belief. Number 4. Rechel Wade. Not all of Florida's infamous female crimes involve money, insurance, or years of planning. Some are fueled by something far more reckless: jealousy and teenage rage. The tragic case of Rechel Wade, a 19-year-old from Pinellas Park, reveals just how quickly youthful rivalry can spiral into lethal violence. Rechel Wade was an ordinary young woman in 2009, working at a local restaurant and navigating the highs and lows of teenage relationships. But her life became entangled in a dangerous love triangle with 18-year-old Sarah Ludeman. The source of their feud was a young man named Joshua Camacho, who seemed to thrive on the drama of pitting the two against each other. Both Rechel and Sarah believed they were his girlfriend, and both were determined to hold on to him. What might have been dismissed as typical teenage heartbreak escalated into something darker. Rechel and Sarah exchanged heated text messages, voicemails, and confrontations. Rechel's messages in particular revealed growing hostility, with one chilling warning. "Now I know you're not hard to find. I'm going to murder you." On the night of April 14, 2009, tensions reached their breaking point. Sarah and her friends drove to Joshua's house, where Rechel also happened to be. A heated argument erupted, fueled by jealousy and months of resentment. Witnesses said Sarah was unarmed, but Rechel pulled out a kitchen knife she had been carrying. In the chaos, Rechel plunged the blade into Sarah's chest, piercing her heart. Within minutes, Sarah collapsed and died. She was just 18 years old. The community was stunned. Parents who once thought of teenage rivalries as harmless suddenly saw the frightening consequences of unchecked anger in the age of cell phones and instant communication. Prosecutors painted Rechel as an aggressor who had premeditated violence through her threatening messages. The defense argued she acted in fear, surrounded by Sarah and her friends. But the jury saw it differently. Rechel Wade was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years in prison. In court, she wept as Sarah's family expressed the devastation of losing their daughter to such senseless violence. What makes Rechel's case resonate beyond Florida is its relatability. This wasn't the story of a seasoned criminal or a calculated financial scheme. It was the story of teenage rivalry, of two young women manipulated by a boy who played them against each other, and of one young woman who let anger destroy not only her rival's life, but her own future. The Rechel Wade case stands as a grim warning about the volatility of jealousy and the tragic consequences that can unfold when tempers flare unchecked. In Florida's long list of infamous women behind bars, Rechel's story is one of the youngest and most impulsive, a tragedy born not from greed or revenge, but from teenage obsession spiraling out of control. Number 5. Dalia Dippolito. If Florida is known for anything in true crime, it's the cases that seem too outrageous to be real. And perhaps no story embodies that better than the saga of Dalia Dippolito, the Boynton Beach newlywed who became infamous for trying to hire a hitman to kill her husband, only to have the entire plot caught on camera. Dalia was a young, attractive woman in her 20s when she married Michael Dippolito in 2009. Michael was no stranger to trouble himself, having previously served time for fraud. Their whirlwind romance seemed glamorous on the surface, but beneath it lay financial disputes and suspicions of infidelity. Prosecutors later argued that Dalia wanted Michael out of the picture to gain access to his money and live freely. Instead of pursuing divorce, she turned to a far more sinister option. In July 2009, she reached out to what she believed was a professional hitman, offering cash and jewelry in exchange for murdering her husband. What she didn't know was that her supposed hitman was actually an undercover police officer, and every meeting was being recorded. The footage, which later went viral, showed Dalia casually discussing the murder plot. When the officer asked if she was certain, she responded without hesitation, "I'm 5,000% sure." That chilling certainty became one of the most replayed lines in true crime history. On the morning of August 5, 2009, police staged an elaborate ruse. They informed Michael that his life was in danger and asked for his cooperation. While he was safely hidden away, officers went to the Dippolito home, where cameras were already rolling for a reality TV show called Cops. Dalia was greeted outside by officers pretending to break the news of her husband's murder. Her dramatic sobbing and apparent shock were captured in full detail, but within hours, she was arrested and confronted with the truth. Dalia's legal battle stretched on for nearly a decade, with multiple trials, appeals, and claims of entrapment. Her defense argued that the entire situation was a setup fueled by law enforcement's eagerness for publicity. But prosecutors emphasized the damning video evidence, which showed her planning the crime and confirming her deadly intentions. In 2017, after years of courtroom drama, Dalia Dippolito was convicted of solicitation to commit first-degree murder and sentenced to 16 years in prison. The case drew massive media attention, not just because of its bizarre and cinematic nature, but because it raised unsettling questions. How could someone speak so casually about ending a life? And how does reality television shape the way we perceive justice? For many, Dalia's downfall symbolized a uniquely Floridian blend of crime, spectacle, and sensationalism. She wasn't just a criminal, she became a cultural talking point. Her words replayed endlessly in news segments and online memes. Today, Dalia remains one of Florida's most notorious female offenders, remembered not for subtlety, but for her brazen certainty that murder was her solution. Number 6. Casy Anthony. When it comes to Florida crime, no name has stirred more outrage and debate than Casy Anthony. Her case wasn't just another tragedy. It became a media storm that captivated the entire nation, leaving millions stunned at its outcome. Casy was a young mother living in Orlando with her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee. On the surface, they seemed like a picture of innocence. But in June 2008, Kaylee disappeared. And the timeline that unfolded afterward raised questions that would haunt the case forever. For 31 days after Kaylee was last seen, Casy told friends and family that her daughter was staying with a nanny named Zanny. She continued to go out partying, posting smiling photos online, and living as though nothing was wrong. But when Casey's mother finally reported Kaylee missing on July 15th, police began unraveling a web of lies. The supposed nanny didn't exist, and every place Casey claimed to work or visit turned out to be fabricated. In December 2008, Kaylee's remains were discovered in a wooded area near the Anthony family home, inside a trash bag with duct tape on her skull. The discovery turned the case into a national obsession, with every detail scrutinized on nightly news broadcasts. Prosecutors argued that Casey murdered her daughter because she saw Kaylee as a burden that interfered with her carefree lifestyle. They pointed to her month of partying, her fabricated stories, and internet searches found on the family computer for terms like chloroform and neck-breaking. To many, the evidence seemed overwhelming, but the defense painted a very different picture. They argued that Kaylee had drowned accidentally in the family pool, and that Casey's bizarre behavior afterward was the result of growing up in a dysfunctional, abusive household. They claimed her lies were the product of panic and fear, not guilt. The trial began in May 2011 and quickly became one of the most watched in American history. Viewers across the country followed every testimony, every photograph, and every piece of forensic evidence. The media dubbed it the trial of the decade. Then came the shocking verdict. On July 5, 2011, the jury acquitted Casy Anthony of first-degree murder, manslaughter, and child abuse. She was found guilty only of lying to police. With time served, she walked free. The reaction was explosive. Crowds outside the courthouse shouted in anger. Television hosts and legal experts expressed disbelief. For many Americans, it felt like justice had been denied for little Kaylee. Casey quickly became one of the most hated women in the country, her name synonymous with scandal and suspicion. More than a decade later, the controversy hasn't faded. Casey maintains her innocence, and her story continues to fuel documentaries, interviews, and endless debate. Was this a case of reasonable doubt, or a miscarriage of justice? What remains undeniable is the emotional weight of Kaylee's short life, and how her death exposed deep flaws in both the justice system and public trust. Florida has seen its share of notorious cases, but none has divided opinion quite like Casy Anthony. Number 7. Jennifer Mee. Not every Florida crime story begins with a hardened criminal or a dark past. Sometimes it begins with a teenager who became a viral sensation. Jennifer Mee, once known to the world as the Hiccup Girl, is one of the strangest examples of how a quirky brush with fame turned into a life sentence behind bars. Back in 2007, Jennifer Mee was just 15 years old when she made national headlines for an unusual condition: uncontrollable hiccups. She suffered from a bizarre case that caused her to hiccup up to 50 times a minute. Her story went viral before going viral was even common, landing her on morning talk shows, news broadcasts, and The Today Show. She was portrayed as a sympathetic figure, a normal teenager burdened with a mysterious condition. But as the cameras faded and her hiccups eventually subsided, Jennifer's life took a darker turn. By the time she was in her late teens, she had dropped out of school, struggled financially, and drifted into risky behavior. What began as a human interest story spiraled into something far more tragic. In October 2010, Jennifer, then 19, was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in the death of Shannon Griffin, a 22-year-old man she lured to a St. Petersburg home under the pretense of meeting up for a date. Prosecutors said Jennifer was part of a robbery scheme with 2 male accomplices. Griffin was shot and killed during the attempted robbery, and though Jennifer never pulled the trigger, Florida's felony murder rule held her equally responsible for his death. The contrast between Jennifer's early fame and her shocking arrest captivated the public. The same girl, once seen as a sweet, unlucky teenager, was now facing the most serious charge imaginable. During her trial in 2013, prosecutors played recordings of her police interrogation, where she admitted to setting up Griffin. Her defense argued she was manipulated and had no idea the robbery would turn violent, but the jury wasn't swayed. Jennifer Mee was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. At just 22 years old, her life outside the prison walls was effectively over. The Hiccup Girl case became a cautionary tale about fleeting fame, poor choices, and the unforgiving nature of the justice system. To some, Jennifer's sentence felt harsh, given she hadn't fired the fatal shot. To others, it was a reminder that accountability doesn't disappear when tragedy strikes. Today, Jennifer is remembered not for her viral hiccups, but for the murder that destroyed 2 young lives. Shannon Griffin's, who never returned home, and her own, as she spends decades in a Florida prison cell. Her story closes the list of Florida's most infamous women. Proof that beneath the sunshine and headlines, the state's darkest stories can come from the most unexpected places. Florida is often painted as a paradise of beaches, palm trees, and endless sunshine. But as we've seen, behind the postcard image lies a state with stories that are as dark as they are unforgettable. From Judy Buenoano, the so-called Black Widow who poisoned her loved ones for insurance money, to Jennifer Mee, the teenage viral sensation who traded her hiccup fame for a life sentence, these cases remind us that evil often hides in plain sight. Each woman we've explored in this Florida special reveals something different about human nature and the justice system. Judy showed us how calculated greed can stretch across years. Ashley McArthur revealed how betrayal can come from someone you once trusted most. Sheila Keen-Warren, the killer clown, demonstrated how far someone might go to conceal identity and strike fear. And Rechel Wade's case warned us about the dangers of teenage jealousy and unchecked emotions. Then there was Dalia Dippolito, whose chilling attempt to hire a hitman unfolded like something out of a television drama. Casy Anthony, perhaps the most infamous of all, left the entire nation divided over questions of guilt, evidence, and truth. And finally, Jennifer Mee, who began as a figure of sympathy and curiosity, only to become another cautionary tale of wasted potential and deadly choices. Taken together, these 7 women paint a haunting picture of Florida's criminal history. They are not monsters in the shadows, but people who once lived ordinary lives, neighbors, co-workers, daughters, even mothers. What makes their stories so compelling is how quickly ordinary circumstances can twist into tragedy, leaving lives shattered in their wake. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. Crime isn't confined to the darkest alleys or the hardened criminals we imagine in movies. Sometimes it comes from the smiling face next door, the coworker we trust, or even the teenager who once appeared on national TV. Florida's sunshine may blind us to its shadows, but as these cases prove, those shadows are always there, waiting. So now I'll turn the question to you. Which of these Florida cases shocked you the most? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more deep dives into true crime stories from across the US, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because here on The Row Line, we expose the stories that others prefer to keep buried.